I first learned about the creatures in European folklore known as changelings after reading Supernatural by Graham Hancock. In the book, he talks about all kinds of supernatural beings, from the human-animal hybrid spirits depicted in prehistoric cave art, to fairies and elves, and even ghosts and aliens. In the chapters discussing fairy lore, he sheds light on the very peculiar phenomena that was common in the Middle Ages, primarily in Western Europe, known as changelings. A changeling is most commonly described as being a strange, sickly fairy child that could also have physical deformities and even possess uncanny insight and intelligence far beyond their years. Some tales describe them as having alien-like features such as unusually long limbs, large heads or long teeth, and sometimes even having full beards. It is said that changelings are the beings that the fairies swapped healthy human children for. Sometimes the changeling would be a very loud and vulgar child that taunts and plays practical jokes on the mother or caretaker. Conversely, we have the English poet George Waldron, who lived in the Isle of Man during the early 18th century, who speaks of a tale of a possible changeling that was shown to him. When he met the child, he noted how it never spoke, rarely ate anything, and almost never smiled or cried. But if anyone called him a fairy or elf, he would intensely frown and fix his eyes so maliciously on those who said it, as if he was staring right into their soul. The legends and descriptions of these beings vary across different regions and times throughout history, with some Irish and Scottish legends describing them as exhibiting unusual behavior when they think no one is watching, like jumping around and dancing or even playing instruments. In order to get a changeling to reveal its true identity, they could be tricked into speech or made to laugh. One tale describes a mother who had a suspicion that her child might be a changeling. This was proven correct when a neighbor ran into the house yelling that the nearby fairy hill was on fire. The fairy child overheard this and jumped out of his crib, crying out for his wife and kids before making his way out the chimney. So this phenomena of supernatural beings stealing human babies isn't exclusively the work of fairies. In fact, we can read that in Germanic folklore, it's believed that the parents of changelings are nixies, which are shape-shifting water spirits or water nymphs that can appear in human form. A couple hundred miles northwest, around Scotland and England, it was said that elves living in elf hills were the ones who could spirit away the human children. They'd leave their sickly changelings here and bring the human child back to Elfheim. The human child would be treated well by the elves and would grow up to be just like them. In Nordic traditions, it was believed that it was trolls or beings from the subterranean realms that exchanged the children. I guess the next question is, why do these supernatural entities want human children? And why do they leave changelings in their place? Again, theories range from one region to another, with some saying that the fairies want humans to strengthen their bloodline. It's possible that they saw the beauty in humankind and wanted to have some of our traits. Others say that it might have been preferred for humans to raise fairy offspring instead. Particularly in Irish folklore, it was suggested that some changelings could actually be older fairies that chose to live the remaining years they had in the human world. While researching this subject, I came across an interesting tale of an evil Irish fairy known as the Darrig, which is spelt like Far Darrig. This is a fairy that spends his time playing cruel tricks and jokes on unsuspecting people. After reading Supernatural by Graham Hancock, I can't help but make the somewhat obvious connection that this mythical being somewhat resembles the trickster and jester entities commonly seen by people who smoke DMT. While this Irish trickster entity seems much more cruel, DMT tricksters, commonly seen as the archetypes of medieval jesters, clowns, and harlequins, have been reported to taunt and play jokes on the person under the influence of DMT. Speaking on the Irish Darrig, Bella Torino writes, quote, "Occasionally they venture into the land of humans, where they delight in startling people by knocking upon their doors in the dead of night and asking to warm themselves at the fire. Never refuse such a request, as it is exceedingly bad luck, and you may wake to find a changeling in your child's crib, or that your cows have come down with the pox." So, that's another possible mythological explanation for the changeling phenomena. A twisted practical joke by an evil trickster fairy. A much more well-known trickster figure in Irish folklore would be the mischievous little green men known as leprechauns. But we can find the myth of the trickster appearing in almost every culture on Earth, with some of the most notable being the coyote in Native American myths, Loki in Norse mythology, and Seth in Egyptian mythology. This raises the question, could all these entities be essentially the same thing, perceived through different states of consciousness across different cultures? I think it's fairly safe to say that the rational explanation for the mythical creatures known as changelings would be the superstitious minds of medieval people unaware of the real medical conditions and physical ailments that are now thoroughly researched and proven by modern science. It's worth mentioning the psychiatric disorder known as Capgras delusion, which is when a person holds the delusion that a close friend or family member has been replaced by an identical imposter. We can find a lot of similarities in these cases to the Salem witch trials, whereby a group of people would usually become suspicious of women practicing witchcraft and burn them at the stake. It involves a similar thought process of spiritual superstition in a time before the scientific revolution, and there were countless cases of children wrongly accused of being changelings. Some of the tragic ways people would try to force the changeling to reveal itself and return the original child would involve many different forms of verbal and physical abuse, torture, and even murder. Putting the child in the oven, beating it, and attempts at drowning were some of the common methods used. While researching for this video, I found a shocking true story that happened in 1826, where a mother drowned her 4-year-old son in an attempt to drive the changeling out of him. And somewhat unbelievably, the jury ruled her not guilty of murder. Another famous story, and possibly one of the last and most recent cases of a witch burning style murder, was the story of Bridget Cleary in 1895. After coming home from a walk one day, Bridget became very sick, and her husband believed that his wife had been stolen by the fairies, and that the woman who returned home that day was a sickly changeling. One reason why he might have believed this was because supposedly their house had been built on top of a fairy hill. In the gruesome events that followed, her husband threw her down on the ground in front of the fireplace and assaulted her with a burning piece of wood. Bridget's clothes caught on fire, and he followed up by dousing her in kerosene. He managed to keep the witnesses away from her body as it burned, insisting that she was a changeling and that he would get his wife back from the fairies. During the trials that followed, her medical diagnosis from her doctor stated that she was likely just suffering from bronchitis. I'm pretty sure many of these changeling stories are the result of religious or paranormal superstition of the nature I previously described. However, I do like to entertain the idea that there could be a second layer of truth to all of this. It seems like the supernatural beings we know as changelings, fairies, elves, dwarves, trolls, and other such spirits all have some things in common. While we do still learn about them in fantasy novels and movies as children, and they become embedded in our subconscious as we grow up, these beings were at the front of mind in the collective consciousness of the Middle Ages when people questioned the nature of reality and if other forms of life exist. In the earliest antiquity, it was the shamans in South America encountering animal spirits during intense ayahuasca sessions. In modern times, we've shifted our paranormal focus more towards aliens, UFOs, cryptids, and more recently, DMT entities. Notice how the story of supernatural kidnappings shifted from fairies stealing humans to aliens abducting humans. Is it possible that all these beings have been the same kind of entity the whole time, and that what makes them appear differently is the cultural and historical lens in which they're viewed? Is it our minds that shapeshift them to what we might expect them to look like? Or are they the ones doing the shapeshifting according to the cultural context? If I'm being honest, I haven't got a fucking clue to the answer to any of these questions. But if I may continue speculating, perhaps at their base form, they're all simply just interdimensional light beings, capable of being omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient, and presenting themselves to us when we enter altered states of consciousness. Unfortunately, that still doesn't answer the question as to why these beings give us the experience of being abducted, and brought into other realms or flying saucers. Perhaps there really are entities out there that don't have our best interests in mind. So, it seems that by changing the way our brain perceives reality, similar to changing the channel on a TV or the station on a radio, our brains can tune into a different channel of reality. Whether it be from taking mind-altering drugs such as psychedelics, doing practices like fasting for extended periods of time, entering deep states in meditation, or simply just believing in them, it seems that we too can become witness to the supernatural.